context of war, of oppression, of human rights violations, in all sorts of particular political contexts. That is to say, many people disappeared from the world stage in all sorts of ways with no one noticing. So if we actually look at the number of names that actually do get recorded, so this is, from a philosophical point of view, it's always been around, and there's a certain amount of doing it. But if we actually look at the number of names that we know in the world, and we know this pretty well because, as you probably know, the Mormons have a huge genealogical project. The Mormons try to collect all the names of everyone who ever lived. And they're up to about 6 billion, which is not close to everyone who ever lived, but it's a lot. And so we can plot the rise of the number of names. And they start going up fairly dramatically in the 16th century, and they skyrocket in the 19th century. So in real life, names start appearing and connected to people a lot more in the period we're talking about than they did before. So names are the names. We've talked a little bit about the names of slaves who have names and who have life stories and whose life stories get recorded. And we have also the names in connection to soldiers who died in battle. In most battles before, in fact, almost all battles before the 19th century, soldiers went off to war and were killed, and that was the end of it. Where cities were razed and the inhabitants were murdered, and no one had any sense of the name. And you start getting in the early 19th century, can I turn the light off? You can see it's a little better. Which one is going to do this? Is the board? Can you guys, is this okay? Can you still read? I just want to show you this picture, then I can turn it back on. It's a picture by William Turner, the greatest English artist of the 19th century, and it's a picture of these great masses of the dead at Waterloo, the Battle of Waterloo. And what he's interested in here, you see here a woman going around trying to find her husband, trying to identify one of these corpses. And Turner and many of his compatriots are horror-struck that all these guys are going to die and are actually dug into the soil. I mean, we're talking into the sort of tens of thousands without any notice being taken. And that's in fact what happened. There's very few names on the battlefield of Waterloo. But what he wants to show here is this person here with a torch, going around and trying to find in this great heap of bodies someone that they know. And we actually know from manuscript and other sources that Turner went to great length himself to see if he could find out which regiment these dead were in this place. So he's actually he's not only interested in representing in general, he's actually personally interested in trying to identify and make this not just a general mass of dead, but particular dead people. So, the dead, the individual dead of battle, of other kind of catastrophe, of slavery and so forth, people come to want to associate a name with these in the 19th century. And I'll try to explain why that in a moment. Okay, so that's the beginning. Let's look, what actually happens is, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Gettysburg and the imperative of the name. So one of the first moments of this is in America, and I want to focus on the Battle of Gettysburg and the cemetery of Gettysburg, which is the first national cemetery in the world, is the first national cemetery in the world, but it's a specific play on a Greek cemetery. So what happens at Gettysburg? Large numbers of men were killed in these 3 days. By large numbers, I mean on each side something less than 10,000. Significant number of people. And here they are lying in the battlefield. And they're buried as quickly as possible. The Union dead, slightly more decently the Confederate dead, but they're all buried. And then there's a lot of inquiry from a lot of people, where are their sons? This government, the state, had no interest and no mechanism to find out where anyone was. There were no dog tags. There was no officially mandated form of identification. So insofar as you could find out where these people were, a parent or relative had to pay someone to try to find these bodies and try to find out whether my son or husband's amongst them. And the way they did this was they literally paid people to go around and say, well, my son always carried my picture with him and it had my name on the back. Many soldiers would carry a name with them and put it in their pocket in case they were killed. So go dig up these bodies and try to find the names. And many, many other were identified. So this grew up out of not the state being interested in building a national monument, but in ordinary people being interested in where their dead were. Why is that the case? I think that's the case because of a tremendous increase in literacy, so that people are actually communicating back and forth. If 15 or 20% are literate, there's not, especially even less amongst the very poor, you're not going to get a lot of letters back. A soldier goes off, or someone goes off, and that's kind of the end of them from the point of view of their families. In the American Civil War and its subsequent wars, people actually wrote letters back home. So this wasn't just someone who dropped off the face of the earth, this was someone that you had a connection with. This kind of connection then also plays itself out in ideologies of family, where the creation of sentimental songs about your mother and about your home, and so forth. And it plays itself out, I think, in a whole bunch of literary genres, which I alluded to already at the very beginning of the course, as things important in changing sensibilities, in the sense that if there's anything that's sort of characteristic of the novel, it's a love story. It's a deathbed scene. So there are no deathbed scenes in regular people, at least, dying on stage in Shakespearean tragedies. You know, novels have a lot of ordinary people dying. And this is the century of the rise of the obituary in newspapers, of deathbed stories in religious magazines. So this is now the age in which everyone, if not everyone literally has a story told about their death, but everyone could have a story told about their death. Every ordinary person could have a story told about their death. So my first point then is that there's an interest in civil society in naming the dead. So it's not, my argument would be not so much that individualism causes the interest in naming of the dead, but sort of the other way around, that interest in naming the dead is constitutive of a certain individual where each human being matters. So that's the civil society part. Now one has all these bodies at Gettysburg being named. In 1863, it occurs to someone that this could be a new kind of national site. It could be a new kind of national site for memory, and it could be a place in which the nation is rededicated on the bodies of its dead. So then you have the great memorial ceremony at Gettysburg, in which Lincoln gave this, probably the most famous speech in American history, which is the speech, which is his dedication speech at Gettysburg. Let me show you what Gettysburg looks like, and I'll tell you something about the speech. Earlier photograph of this. So there they are, the dead of this battle, which is the central battle of the decides the Battle of the Civil War. So that's, I did it slightly reverse. That's the civil society part I just spoke to you about. Now I'm speaking to you about the national part. So where does this come from, the idea that we should have a national cemetery? Well, none of you, I suspect, have read the other speech that was given at Gettysburg. You wouldn't have. There's no reason you should. It's by a Harvard professor named Everett, who was very famous in his day. He was a professor of Greek and Latin. He became president of Harvard. He was a U.S. senator. So Lincoln was in some sense the opening act. And Everett was the main speaker, was the main event. Everett gave a 2.5-hour long speech, which is fascinating to historians, but can't have been great to listen to. No interruptions, no questions. On the subject of the Battle of Marathon. Now you ask, what does the Battle of Marathon have to do with Gettysburg? Well, the Battle of Marathon was the battle in which the Greeks stopped the Persians, and hence Western civilization stopped the hordes from the east. As at Gettysburg, the Union stopped the Confederacy and the hordes from the south. At Marathon, unlike at other Greek battles, the soldiers were not cremated and brought back to Athens to be buried in it, but instead were buried at Marathon. And at Marathon, there was a battlefield monument, a tomb, and there were stelae, columns, in which the names of the dead were listed. that column, those columns, and that tomb, built in the 5th century, was still around 8th and 9th centuries later. So every educated American, and many more Americans were educated into the classics than are now, even ordinary people who didn't actually read Latin and Greek, but heard these stories, knew about the Battle of Marathon, and the fact that Marathon was the place where Western civilization was saved, and where the dead, the body of men who saved Western civilization, are remembered by name. So that's Everett's talk. Everett tells you. Lincoln does a slightly different version of the talk. Lincoln gives the talk in which the nation is rededicated on the principle of equality. It's really when the Declaration of Independence becomes the central sort of feature of American rhetoric, principle of equality, based on the funeral oration of Pericles that in all other circumstances would be said over the dead bones of the warriors come back to Athens. So they mix these two things. The Marathon is, Gettysburg is like Marathon in this place, and Everett speaks to this analogy. And Gettysburg, or the dead of Gettysburg, are like the dead of Athens who saved the democracy, and on whose bodies the democracy is recreated. So Lincoln gives amazing that we cannot concentrate these grounds. Those dead have consecrated, dedicated far more than we. Right? So there's the idea then of these named dead being the place where you reconstitute the nation. And it has become a national shrine. And if you go there now, you will find, sort of, even in our modern cynical selves, there's something rather remarkable about the place. Rather magical. So it works as a place. So we have two things going on here in naming the dead. In this history, we have the perspective of civil society, in which people want to know who their dead soldiers are, their dead brothers and husbands and family members, without having any great interest in the national project. And we have sort of the appropriation or the reformulation of that as part of a national project of building a nation on the dead. Well, let me just move on. So that's the first time this happens, as far as I know, in world history since antiquity. So that in itself is a remarkable story, and I think is sort of part of the story that we've been telling in the course, which is this interest that the individual human life matters in some way, and what happens communally speaks to something about the nature of the community of the living. In the European context, the first time this happens in any kind of large way is in the Great War, the War of 1914 to 1918. In the beginning of the story is very much the same. None of the great powers, none of the powers had any mechanisms for keeping track of the dead. No bureaucracies, no name tags, no dog tags, none of that stuff. That's all of the development of this period. And the American Army got dog tags in 1916, in case you're interested. Records, insofar as they were kept locally by regiments, of which there were 40 or 50 in the state. So very decentralized records. So what happens in the Great War? What happens in the Great War is the following: all the nations of Europe, less Russia, in its post-revolutionary context. It's hard to know what Russia is in the immediate years after the war, and Russia's had a complicated relationship to its war dead, which is still being debated. So I want to leave Russia out of this for a moment. But every other country